So this panel here is a panel I've really been looking forward to this seminar. Now you may be wondering if you've looked at your program, where's Walter Hopp? And he is not here. This is Dan Sheffler, not Walter Hopp. But we are, and in fact, Walter. A little bit of backstory. So actually for some time now, there's been a mutual awareness of the students of Dietrich von Hildebrand and Dallas Willard, now the late Dallas Willard. And the discovery, I think, probably goes back even to Dallas himself, because he knew of von Hildebrand, and then he met Alice von Hildebrand, and they came and spoke here at a conference together. And then I had a chance a number of years ago to be invited to a colloquium organized by the students of Dallas Willard on this book that was left unfinished and then completed at the time of his death, The Disappearance of Moral Knowledge. And Aaron Preston was among the students and authors of this book. And it was a tremendously rewarding experience, and that's where Aaron and I met. And then I guess the rest is history, because ever since then we've been doing things together. And the most recent of those was an advanced reading group that brought together students of Dallas Willard and Dietrich von Hildebrand and others interested in personalism. And the fruit of that is of course, the presence now of Aaron. Also in that reading group was Walter, who is only not with us due to the death of a cousin, tragic young death, and so our hearts go out to him and his family. But he was kind enough to still manage to produce his remarks and send them to Aaron, who will deliver a combination of the two. And then Dan Sheffler, I think everyone now realizes that you have many competences, from obviously Platonism and ancient thought and so on, all the way to bourbon. High
Very
level of expertise in bourbon, extremely competent in bourbon, banking, investment, the science of sound. We have quite some good discussions about recording equipment and records versus CDs, et cetera. So it turns out that Dan also has quite a history with Dallas Willard and Dallas Willard's work. So we're delighted that Dan is willing to join this panel. So gentlemen, I don't know who's going to go first, but we're really happy to have you all here.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. We are going to go in the following order. I'm going to deliver my own remarks first, and then I'm going to hand off to Dan, and then it'll come back to me to read Walter's remarks. So I thought I'd begin, since I kind of assumed that many in the audience were not familiar with Dallas, just a sort of introduction to the man and then his work. If you've never heard of Dallas Willard before, the most important things to know about him here and now are that he was a professor of philosophy at the University of Southern California, one of the world's leading experts on Edmund Husserl and early phenomenology, a defender of the realist understanding of phenomenology embraced by von Hildebrand, and a profound thinker, writer, teacher, and practitioner in the area of Christian spiritual formation, who recovered for many 20th century Christians important parts of the Christian tradition with which they had lost touch. While his reputation as an academic was mainly limited to those with an interest in Husserl, his work on spiritual formation won him a massive international audience comprised of people from many different denominations, Protestant, Anabaptist, Catholic, and Orthodox, both liberal and conservative, and even from non-Christian religions. When I was an undergraduate, a Buddhist priest sat in on one of Dallas's upper division philosophy classes for a semester because of his reputation as a spiritual teacher. Doubtless there were many factors that enabled Dallas to speak to people from so many different backgrounds, not least his intelligence and his character, more on which shortly. But one important factor was Dallas's refusal to enter into theological controversies that did not impinge directly on Christian living. In a 2009 interview with a publication of Gordon College called Still Point, Dallas made a comment that seems especially fitting to mention in this context. At one point, the interviewer asked Dallas, "There's still quite a gap between Protestants and Catholics. Do you see yourself as having been called into that gap?" He answered, "I do believe that. What I have found when dealing with Catholics or Protestants is that living the spiritual life is common ground. If you get into transubstantiation, consubstantiation, all those stantiations, that's the end of the discussion. But when you're talking about prayer, holiness, virtue, following Jesus, living the life, you're right on common ground. I've come to call obedience to Christ the true ecumenicity, because that is the meeting place. As long as people focus on that, there will be very few arguments. Just about everyone who knew Dallas will say two things about him. First, that he was incredibly smart. Second, that he was incredibly good. In a tribute published in Christianity Today on the day Dallas died, May 8th, 2013, the prominent evangelical pastor John Ortberg said that Dallas was the smartest man I have ever known, but it was the quality of his life, the extent to which he lived in the reality of the kingdom, that shaped the people who knew him the best. I can affirm that. In a tribute that I wrote for Dallas sometime later, I said that two lines come to mind whenever I think of Dallas Willard. The first is from John's Gospel. No one ever spoke the way this man does. The second is Plato's description of Socrates from the closing line of the Phaedo. The best, wisest, and most righteous of all the men whom I have ever known. I was not exaggerating. Dallas's colleague, the eminent philosopher of language, Scott Soames, noted that Dallas was the teacher with the greatest range in the School of Philosophy at USC, regularly teaching courses in logic, metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, history of ethics, philosophy of religion, and the history of philosophy from the 17th through the 20th centuries, including both sides of the 20th century split between analytic philosophy and phenomenology. Soames also described him as that professor of lore who students hope to find but really don't expect to, the one who enriches their lives by getting them to see more in themselves and in life itself than they had imagined. Perhaps my favorite testimonial about Dallas comes from my friend Kat Moore, who is now USC's Director of Belonging and is quickly becoming something of a celebrity for her astonishingly successful efforts at combating the epidemic of loneliness that plagues our nation, and especially our youth today. As a freshman at USC, a friend dragged her to one of Dallas's upper division philosophy classes. She recalls, "I remember him standing in the doorway, welcoming all the students on that first day of class. When class was dismissed, I said to myself, I'm studying whatever that man teaches because he knows what he's talking about. But more than that," she said, "he lived what he was talking about." Kat recalls being reduced to tears on account of the warmth, the sincerity, and the dignity with which he effortlessly treated me. His genius, she says, was in creating a safe and open dynamic that encouraged genuine reflection. There was no pressure, no agenda, no superiority in his manner. He was just there to instruct, to listen to where we were at, and to help us. Once that teacher-student relationship of trust was established, he was able to focus on the careful and rigorous development of our thinking. As precisely and gently as he guided my intellectual development, what I am most grateful for is the life he showed me was possible to live because he himself was exemplifying it. I know exactly what Kat is talking about. Almost everyone who has ever written anything about Dallas mentions and describes more adequately than I can the aura of otherworldly peace and love that he exuded, and which suffused the whole atmosphere around him. There was a calmness and a stillness in Dallas that pervaded all of his other virtues, and which I think tended to impress people more than almost anything else about him. John Ortberg cleverly describes him as a man from another time zone, because he was so firmly planted on that still point of the turning world that he manifested something like eternity in his person. In Hildebrandian terms, I suppose we'd say that Dallas lived from a superactual state of recollection and contemplation, in which the goodness of God was constantly before his mind, and on that account poured through him into our world in a tangible way. Now, I'm giving so much attention to Dallas's personality and character, not merely or even primarily because I enjoy singing his praises, which I do, but because, as he would be the first to tell you, his remarkable qualities were to a large extent the result of a method of transformation that he believed was in principle available to everybody. And in connection with this point, there are a number of things about Dallas's early life that we might discuss at some point that give considerable plausibility to what in one of the talks yesterday was called the compensation hypothesis in attachment theory, where God comes to take the place of the earthly parent in terms of an attachment figure. But I'm not going to go into that now on account of time. Dallas would often explain this method in terms of the acronym VIM, standing for vision, intention, and means. Even in mundane matters like learning a language or a musical instrument, transformation from a state of being unable to speak the language or play the instrument to being able to do so requires a vision for the good to be achieved, the intention to achieve it, and the means by which to achieve it. In the case of spiritual transformation into Christ-likeness, the heart of the relevant vision is the goodness of God as revealed in Jesus, and the crucial means of achieving it are spiritual disciplines. For Dallas, a discipline is anything that you can presently do by direct effort that will, after repeated practice, enable you to do what you cannot presently do by direct effort. For example, statistically, it is unlikely that there are many of us in this room who could presently, by direct effort, perform 100 push-ups sequentially. But, barring injuries or disabilities, there is probably some number of push-ups that each of us could perform right now by direct effort. And if you were to make a regular practice of performing however many push-ups you can perform by direct effort today, you would soon find yourself able to do more. You could then increase the number that you perform with regularity, and you would soon find yourself able to do even more, and so on and so on. Perhaps you'll never hit 100, or perhaps you'll surpass 100. But the point is that you will make progress. The same pattern of practicing what one can presently do by direct effort, enabling us in time to do what we presently cannot do by direct effort, is operative in many arenas of human life, from learning a language to learning to play a musical instrument and beyond. Dallas saw this as a model for spiritual growth as well, and he developed the idea in his 1988 book, The Spirit of the Disciplines. In the preface to that book, Dallas explained that my central claim is that we can become like Christ by doing one thing, by following him in the overall style of life that he chose for himself. If we have faith in Christ, we must believe that he knew how to live. We can, through faith and grace, become like Christ by practicing the types of activities he engaged in, by arranging our whole lives around the activities that he himself practiced, in order to remain constantly at home in the fellowship of his Father. What activities did Jesus practice? Such things as solitude and silence, prayer, simple and sacrificial living, intense study and meditation upon God's word and God's ways, and service to others. Some of these will certainly be even more necessary to us than they were to him because of our greater or different need. But in a balanced life of such activities, we will be constantly enlivened by the kingdom not of this world. Dallas reached back into the tradition to reacquaint modern Christians with disciplines such as those just mentioned. Solitude, silence, study, memorization of long passages of Scripture, not just isolated verses, and fasting were particularly important to him. But he regarded the category of disciplines as open-ended, and he encouraged people to be creative in designing disciplines that address their own particular weak spots. For example, one might cultivate compassion for the poor by choosing to do one's grocery shopping in poorer areas of town. Dallas was aware that the disciplines had frequently been misused in Christian history, turned into spiritually deadening forms of legalism, and even used as instruments of spiritual abuse. He was also aware that Protestants, especially, tended to have theological hang-ups about disciplines, grounded in what he regarded as misunderstandings about the relations among grace, faith, and works. Grace, Dallas believed, is not limited to the forgiveness of sins, as many Protestants are apt to believe, but it includes God's making himself and his power available to human beings, especially those who are, on the basis of the guiding vision of reality and goodness revealed in Christ, willing to enter into a cooperative relationship with him. However, it is up to us to attend to the vision, which is a discipline always available to us. Dallas believed that the primary power of human freedom is the power to direct our attention. Thoughts and feelings often arise unbidden, but whether we grant or refuse them our attention is up to us. In this, Dallas was explicitly following William James, who, interestingly and importantly for this group, was following the French personalist Charles Renouvier. In any case, the solution to both these sets of problems, the theological hang-ups and the misuse of the disciplines, Dallas thought, lay in a proper understanding of the way in which disciplines fit into a holistic picture of the Christian life. The disciplines have their proper place in the context of an interactive, cooperative, and indeed a conversational relationship with God, which God himself has initiated by revealing himself to us through his word and through the word made flesh, Jesus Christ. In doing so, God gave us a vision for the goodness to be achieved in human life, the good of love. Quoting again from the preface to the Spirit of the Disciplines, Dallas says, "The spirit of the disciplines is nothing but the love of Jesus, with its resolute will to be like him whom we love. In the fellowship of the burning heart, exercise unto godliness is our way of receiving ever more fully the grace in which we stand, rejoicing in the hope of the glory of God." Thank you.
Well, so I'm just pinch hitting during this session, so this will be less of a prepared paper or talk. Instead, I simply hope to offer some reflections on my experience teaching Dallas Willard, specifically his book, Spirit of the Disciplines and Renovation of the Heart, and draw some links to Hildebrand in this transformation in Christ, because I think there are a number of deep similarities between the two thinkers about what it takes to transform as a Christian. Not just hoping to change, not just identifying the Christian virtues and wanting to be better, but what it really takes in concreto to change. They offer actually very similar advice and very similar ways of thinking about it, despite very different traditions and very different language. This is somewhat in the same spirit as what Father James offered the other day, that it's remarkable, in fact, that these thinkers from different traditions come to so much of the same points. That should tell us there's really reality that's being discovered here, not just the passing on of a merely verbal tradition. So first, a word about just my experience with Dallas Willard. So I'm a relatively recent convert, swam the Tiber 2 years ago. But before that, I was in a Protestant pastoral context, part-time anyway, while I was still also a professor of philosophy. And I was the director of a spiritual formation program that would happen every summer. I did that for 8 years or so. So this was a 12-week program where students, mostly 18 to 22, kind of college-age students, but sometimes people older, would come in. We would live in a camp, and we would wake up in the morning and have communal times of prayer, study of Scripture, eat breakfast together. We'd have a period of teaching in the morning, communal meal, labor in the afternoon, communal dinner, and then another period of teaching in the end. It's for a 12-week program. The students would fast from entertainment, from any kind of social media, connectedness to any of that, just kind of pull away from the world for a little while and really devote themselves to the attempt to lay some foundations for the Christian life. The idea was to kind of get people young, hopefully kind of towards the beginning of their real adult Christian life, and before they get caught up in some of the craziness of the world and the many temptations that beset us, lay some real practices of spiritual disciplines that would enable them to live a Christian life. And so each week we would have a different focused theme, and that would often be around an author or a work or whatnot, and we would invite a teacher in to come teach for that week. And so one of our weeks consistently was either Dallas Willard's Spirit of the Disciplines or Renovation of the Heart, because these books spoke to what we were trying to do in that summer formation program. And my experience with Dallas Willard is that he is unique among contemporary authors in being accessible to a 19-year-old with no prior experience in spiritual reading, Some of our students were, cradle Christians, but on many occasions, I had people come and join this school who had converted to Christianity just a couple weeks prior to signing up for this program. Students who had never read the Bible before in their lives. And so I was always looking for authors that could give resources to these students, but also be able to speak in a language that they could understand and that they could actually put into practice, that wasn't so far above them and so far down the road that it was just useless. And I found Dallas Willard to be an extremely helpful ally in that quest. He has a remarkable clarity of language, clarity of insight into human behavior, but a way to put that, as the Kentucky side of my family would say, close to the ground where the cows can get at it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Willard's anthropology and his model for transformation in Christ that I find consonant with what we find in Hildebrand. I had Catherine print out a handout that everybody should have. Does everybody have this diagram? Okay, maybe we could pass that around now. So Willard, in several places, he has a model of our psychology, and specifically what's disordered in the ordinary person. And in one place, he has a nice little diagram of a choo-choo train, where you've got the steam engine of the train is our passions, our appetites, our feelings. And that's in the driver's seat, and it's motivating us to do more or less all of the things that we do on a daily basis. We want approval from others. We want to be entertained. We want to stay comfortable in our bed in the morning. We want to have power or control in a particular circumstance. We feel attacked and we want to be vindicated. And so all of our actions and behaviors are following upon those impulses. Okay? And then the car behind, the steam engine of the train, is our will, our mind, our thoughts. We think these thoughts because we're being driven by the passions, and so we choose. We make certain choices to act and get what we want on the basis of those appetites. And then last of all the way in the caboose, is God. Right? God has to sort of chase us and follow along, and that's our lowest priority, what comes at the end. And of course, this is entirely inverted from the way that it should be. So the beginning of transformation occurs when we rearrange the cars of that choo-choo train, okay? And we realize that in the actual nature of things, our will is sovereign over all the other parts of our psychology, all the other parts of our lives. Now, it's not immediately sovereign, as you pointed out, and I used the example of just taking a drink this morning. There are some things that are immediately under my direct control. By direct effort alone, I can accomplish. But many of the things in our psychology are not. We tend to then, when we see that our emotions are not under our direct control, for example, we often tend to despair and say, oh, well, I can't immediately control my anger, therefore I can't control my anger at all. But of course, that's a mistake. You can control anger. Your tendency to anger is under your will, just not immediately so. What you can do by your will is you can begin to put into practice habits. You can protect yourself from the near occasions to sin. You can, as Hildebrand speaks of, decapitate the force of the passion, which doesn't immediately get rid of it altogether, but by addressing it at its root. I forget who spoke about that in an earlier session, but I remember we did address that. You can neutralize your tendency to anger, and over time, it will improve. And it is subject. It might never entirely go away, in the same way that you might not entirely ever be able to do 100 push-ups. There might be some limit to that, at least in this life. We will always be subject to temptations. But it is the kind of thing that we can make progress in. And so when we realize the sovereignty of our will over the rest of our spiritual life, we don't do the satanic thing, which is to put our will at the top and in the driver's seat of that choo-choo train. Instead, we subordinate our will to God, and we allow God to speak to us in the depths of our heart to address the center of who we are. And in this diagram, you have there's a couple nice ways that this is illustrated. So Willard's model of the person is that there are these kind of concentric onion layers of our psychology. So forget the soul for a second. I'll come back to the soul. But the outermost layer would be our social setting, the role that we play, the persona that we put on for others. If you go a level deeper, you have our body, which is not just the physical parts, but also the functioning of that body, your hormones, your heart rate, your brain, all your chemistry, all of that. Go a layer deeper, you've got your mind, which for him is just anything that is cognitive, all of your thoughts, okay? All of your feelings, all of your emotions, what we would typically call your psychology. But then even deeper than that is your spirit or will, which for Willard are the spirit, heart, will are referring to that same core of the person. And all of these are connected to each other, and they're all held together by soul around the out. And this is the place where I think Willard is most idiosyncratic and might be a little bit different than the way that Catholics are used to this word soul, because for Willard, soul is understood as this kind of glue or container that holds all of these different aspects of the person together, which is not so different from thinking that soul is the form of the human being, the form of our life. It's the principle of unity, okay? But there is a little bit of a difference of emphasis, perhaps. And so in this bottom diagram, what you see is that we can kind of skip all the intermediary stages. The outer circle forms your character, which is the relatively stable disposition of your will that manifests in your body, which you can see even in like the posture that you're sitting in right now. Everybody just straightened up a little bit. You can see in the way that you speak, the way that you breathe, your gestures, your characters manifest in your body. Your characters manifest in your psychological dispositions and habits of thought. It's manifest in the social persona that you put on and the way that you present yourselves to others. So all that is encapsulated. But still, your will is at the heart of that, and your character can be changed through actions of the will. Now, I want to draw the link to Hildebrand in what we read in the chapter on true consciousness. Because the way Hildebrand characterizes this transformation is very similar. He says most people, many people at least, are not really awake spiritually. And what that means is that they are submerged in the stream of natural impulses. It's very similar to Willard's feelings and thoughts and whatnot. We have these impulses, cause and effect, and we experience our lives as something that we are undergoing, something that's happening to us, rather than something that we ourselves are doing. True spiritual awakeness, or true consciousness, for Hildebrand, however, involves a moment of waking up and realizing that behind that stream of natural cause and effect, we have a true, what he calls a true spiritual center, a free spiritual center. And it is possible to act from that spiritual center. And Hildebrand has a very interesting notion of endorsing our actions. It's like when you endorse a contract or a statement, you sign on the dotted line. And even though a particular feeling or action might arise from one of my habits, or might be what I have an impulse to do, there's a qualitative difference when I say, okay, yes, I see that that's, my hunger tells me it's time for lunch and I want to eat. But I myself, from my free spiritual center, am endorsing that and I'm choosing to eat right now. That's different from what happens when you have an impulse to eat lunch because you're hungry and you cave. You simply go along with that impulse, even though maybe you've decided to fast or something like that, and it overcomes you. Okay? And so I think this is very consonant with, you can see in this lower diagram, for Willard, you only really begin to act. It only really becomes your actions, properly speaking, when it proceeds from that will, heart, spirit, that core of who you are. And that it's only there that we can really start to properly obey God, because we're not just doing the right thing or following the commandments because it works out for us or it feels good, but because we ourselves have chosen and taken that spiritual center and put it at the foot of the cross, so to speak. So there's my experience and the bridge, and I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. It's not every pinch hitter who can step up to the plate and knock it out of the park on the first pitch. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read Walter's remarks now, and I'll tell you that Walter is, to the best of my knowledge, the only one of Dallas's graduate students over his almost 50 years teaching at USC to follow Dallas as a Husserl scholar, and he's become a very significant Husserl scholar in his own right. And one consequence of that is that his remarks are perhaps a little more philosophical than mine or Dan's. So buckle up. I'm going to, there are some terms that Walter uses that might only be familiar to folks with philosophical training, and we've got a lot of folks with philosophical training here, but I don't think everyone falls into that category. So I'm just going to begin by defining some key terms, and then I'll go ahead and just read what he's written. One is the term intentional, which in this context does not mean purposive, as it does in ordinary discourse, but rather possessed of intentionality, the object-directedness of consciousness, the ofness or aboutness of consciousness, as when we say, I'm thinking of or about this or that. Next is the term doxastic, which means pertaining to belief. Then there's an important distinction between conceptual and perceptual or intuitive forms of consciousness. In perceptual or intuitive consciousness, the intentional object of thought, that which the thought is of or about, is directly given to consciousness. But in merely conceptual consciousness, the object is thought of without being directly given or present to consciousness. Then there's the Husserlian notion of fulfillment, which is a matter of thinking conceptually about some object or state of affairs, while also having that very object or state of affairs directly given in perception or intuition in a way that enables us to see that the object is just as we were thinking it is. For example, I am presently thinking of my car parked up outside of Thomas More Hall. If I were to walk up there and lay my eyes upon it, the perception would fulfill my conceptual thought of the car. Then there's the notion of epistemic authenticity. And Walter says that to possess a concept authentically and to wield it in authentic acts of consciousness is to have the capacity to recognize its object directly in fulfillment. So I Don't expect everyone's going to remember with any precision what those terms mean, but hopefully having heard them and a definition once will help you to grasp what's being said as we move through the comments. So here's Walter. What I admire most about the thought of both Dallas Willard and Dietrich von Hildebrand is their unrivaled ability to paint a psychologically and phenomenologically faithful picture of the human person, both with and without the presence of God in their lives. Both pay attention to the fine-grained configurations of will, heart, and mind of those living before God, and the concrete steps we can take to get and stay there. Dallas draws a contrast between having, before the will, the questions, how can I get my way, and what good can I bring about? Or in Hildebrand's terminology, it is the difference between immersion in the realm of the subjectively satisfying and living a life that is responsive to and productive of objective goods. The task of spiritual formation for each is to overcome our natural tendencies toward the first path and find our way to the second. What I want to address here is the fundamental importance that Dallas, like Hildebrand, attaches to knowledge in the process of spiritual growth. Contrary to what one might believe by examining the works of some of philosophy's luminaries from the past century or so, the cognitive relations that we forge with the world are not primarily established and sustained through the mastery of language games. It is through direct cognitive confrontation with the objects that function as the themes of our thought and discourse. Knowing what the word red means is not principally a matter of knowing how to use it in socially sanctioned ways. It is to know what it refers to, and that is a matter of knowing what red is. The best way to do that is through perception, through the givenness of red itself. And we reach another stage when we not only perceive red, but conceptualize what we see as red, when, to use Husserl's language, we undergo an act of fulfillment. This is the most basic form of conceptual knowledge. One of the marvels of conceptual thinking is that we can think about things without perceiving them. But it is Husserl's view, and Dallas's, and Hildebrand's as well, that even such empty thinking is only authentic when one has some grip on what it would be like to perceive or encounter its object. To possess a concept authentically and to wield it in authentic intentional acts is to have the capacity to have it fulfilled, that is, a capacity to know its object directly in fulfillment. For example, I don't know whether it's raining in Vancouver, but my thought that it is authentic insofar as I know what it would be like to verify the claim experientially. Now, consciousness is not just a matter of referring to things or noting their properties. It is attitudinal. Attitudes include things like belief, doubt, hope, trust, contempt, fear, love, or admiration. Now, for example, I'm throwing this in. Right now, I hope my car is parked in front of St. Thomas More Hall, but I might fear that it has been stolen and doubt that it's there. And if you had come down the hill just now and told me it was there, I would trust you and believe that it is there, and so on. Now, which attitudes we hold toward which things comprises a large part of our personality, and bringing those attitudes under some sort of direction and control is something that both Dallas and Hildebrand recognize to be of fundamental importance. But all of those attitudinal states require intentional content, and if they are to be authentic responses, we must have some authentic grasp of those contents. That is, we must know or know something about the objects in question. As Hildebrand puts it, joy is essentially joy about something. It presupposes knowledge of the object that motivates my joy. We typically don't think of authenticity in connection with knowledge. It is more closely connected, in the popular imagination at least, with doing things one's own way. Sinatra's My Way is an expression of this kind of authenticity, an authenticity located exclusively in the almighty will, which, drawing power from within itself and itself alone, decrees what it will believe, pursue, love, and hate. But this is a mockery of personal authenticity. Authenticity of the volitional kind presupposes authenticity of the epistemic kind. One cannot genuinely stand for or against something without a considerable amount of knowledge of what it is that one stands for or opposes. I cannot fully and authentically value or will something without knowing a lot about it. And this matters because while various aspects of our attitudinal life remain within our control, many become increasingly absurd when paired with epistemic authenticity. This is clearest in the case of the doxastic attitudes. Belief and doubt and disbelief can, ideally speaking, accompany any propositional content. But when it comes to propositions such as, I have hands, or the material world exists, given their content and given the endless and ongoing fulfillment of those propositions through originary experience, doubt starts to look less and less real, or if real, more like a disease than a mark of intelligence. When I believe in material objects, I am going my way only insofar as I am allowing my cognitive life to be governed by the world that is revealed to it in epistemically authoritative, intentional acts. Just as robust understanding and evidence about a subject matter make any doxastic attitude other than conviction an absurdity rather than an expression of freedom or power, a robust apprehension of value makes various affective and volitional responses absurd. To behold something truly excellent, to apprehend its excellence in clear acts of moral or other axiological intuition, and yet to hate it or will its destruction, is a possibility reserved for the deliberately evil. But deliberate evil looks, from the perspective of authentic value consciousness, as idiotic and irrational as doubt or denial in the face of the self-evident. The reason to seek and sustain an unclouded vision of what is good, noble, and worthy of esteem is because doing so will orient our wills almost of its own accord. One of the mainstays of phenomenology is that givenness comes in degrees. Ordinary perception is a case in point. Not only does every material object have causal powers and constitutions hidden from unaided perception, but even their sense-perceptible parts and properties are never given entirely and all at once. And the authenticity of our thought is almost always partial as well. Every object in every genuine sphere of being contains more than we know. This is especially true when it comes to values and valuable projects, a point made powerfully by Tal Brewer in his astonishing work, The Retrieval of Ethics. Most activities worth pursuing over long periods of time are, on his view, dialectical. The nature of dialectical activity is that one cannot completely appreciate or know its value without pursuing it. And as Brewer notes, if the activity's constitutive goods are complex and elusive enough, this dialectical process can be reiterated indefinitely, with each successive engagement yielding a clearer grasp of the activity's proper form and preparing the way for a still more adequate and hence more revealing engagement in it. We enter dialectical activities, such as friendship, parenthood, pursuing a field of knowledge, or here, forging a relationship with God, because of an originary insight into their value. Again, knowledge must inform the will, but that originary insight is inevitably inadequate. It is here that Dallas's work impresses me the most, because of his realistic and phenomenologically informed treatment of the realities of spiritual transformation, and how it can be true both that the will is hemmed in by what our thoughts and feelings actually are at the time of willing, and our thoughts and feelings also have a crucial dependence on our will, on our choices. Clearly, God, along with the vast realm of values and goods that he provides, authorizes, and endorses, is sufficiently complex and elusive to ensure that an adequate grasp of him and them is, in Husserl's words, an infinite task. At the same time, there are lures to God and goodness available to our receptive experience. God does call us in gentle ways to a transformed life. Knowledge here again must be the foundation of volition, but the will must cooperate. Given the realities of the human heart with its pride and lust, and situated as it is in a world of destructive ideas and images, we must use our wills to focus our minds on God and his goods, to keep the sphere of values before our eyes so that our wills can again be moved toward their realization. This back and forth is the structure of a dialectical activity. And for Dallas, it is the direction of our thoughts, in the direction of our thoughts, that the will is most efficacious. Its primary exercise in the human is the power to select what we think on and how intently we will focus on it, from which our other decisions and actions then more or less directly flow. This means a couple of things. For starters, it means that knowledge functions not only as a foundation of present willings, but also as among their goals. We can only authentically will what we authentically think or imagine. At the same time, willing in the direction of God and His goods brings new knowledge into existence, which can then function as a platform for new willings. This, I believe, is a central part of the process of character transformation, as Dallas understands it. What this also means, and this message touches me most deeply, is that there is no need at any point in this process to fake, force, or pretend that we either understand or will or care about things that we really don't. This is because God accepts us as we are wherever we are. And it's also because the process of transformation is necessarily temporally extended. Its objects are necessarily complex. They can only be authentically known in the unfolding of time, and we can only authentically love and will them when we have this knowledge. There are phenomenological laws governing the overall shape of personal transformation, grounded in the metaphysical laws governing the objects that must be known in order for the heart and will to find their orientation. A final brief word. It is a familiar fact to many moral phenomenologists that exemplars of virtue move us more powerfully than sermons and lectures on virtue. There is a simple phenomenological explanation for this, again, grounded in knowledge. In sermons and lectures, our intentions toward virtue are empty, though possibly authentic, while in the life and actions of exemplars, they are intuitively fulfilled. One of the most powerful ways to intuit the transformed life is to intuit someone who lives such a life. Dallas was such a person, and I think for those of us who had the great privilege of knowing him, the words he wrote are amply confirmed by his loving and personal character. Amen, Walter.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions. So we have a microphone in the back there. Please raise your hand if you have a question. And feel free also to, Dan, I don't know if you have anything to add to.
Oh, thank you very much. That was very interesting to hear about the phenomenological perspective on the transformation in Christ. I just wanted to make a comment about St. Francis of Assisi, who famously said, "Preach at all times, if necessary, use words." And then a previous comment earlier was from the data of the experience of his life, we can learn a lot. So it's the phenomenological method writ large on a personal witness who continues to speak to us today. So thank you very much.
Great point.
So I was just wondering, sometimes you'll come across somebody who believes something very deeply, even if they haven't necessarily come to know it philosophically, like someone who lives the moral life very devoutly but doesn't know why, but they still are really, would you say that they just know in a different way, even if they don't really know the why behind it? Because they believe it really strongly, more strongly than maybe a philosopher would.
Well, I mean, I think we'd need to look a little more closely into the grounds of their belief. It's possible to believe something very strongly without an adequate basis. But it's also possible to believe something very strongly with a completely adequate basis and yet not have the capacity to articulate what that basis is, right? So, it takes a certain, for most people, it takes a certain kind of training to be able to step back from the immediacy of their experience and belief and sort of scrutinize their beliefs and figure out what the actual basis for their beliefs is. This happens all the time. You think, why am I thinking about the world this way? And you ponder it, and often you can come to an answer to that question. Sometimes you can't, and if you're a philosopher, generally you'll be worried at that point because you want to have good reasons for your beliefs. But one of the really important insights of phenomenology is that you can have a good basis for a belief in simply the direct givenness or the immediate givenness of, let's say, the value that you think is so important. And even if you can't articulate that to someone else in a way that enables them to see it as well, that doesn't mean that you don't have a perfectly adequate grounding for your belief.
It's also worth mentioning that often that training in articulacy can lead you astray. And often philosophers deceive themselves because something sounds like a good basis for belief, and that masks from themselves what the real basis for their actual belief is. Philosophers believe all things all the time for, not the stated reason.
Right. It's actually one of the really important dimensions of phenomenology, or at least realist phenomenology. Philosophy, historically, you look at lots of examples where philosophers believe things because they hold together with a certain sort of logical consistency. A particular metaphysical view of the world, for example, holds together with a kind of internal logical consistency. But then you ask, well, can you actually verify this in experience? And the cry of the early phenomenologists was, let's go to the things themselves and see if our theory matches up with the given fact. And Husserl and those who followed him thought that was a really important corrective to sort of speculative excess on the part of philosophers.
I'll also just throw in too that to your original point. I don't think that the strength of belief really maps on terribly well in a number of different directions, because I think if you just look around, people believe all kinds of things, even wild things, very strongly. Sometimes very devout people have doubts, so that intensity of conviction can be a good thing, but it can also be a counterproductive thing. And so I think what matters more is what's the real basis? Why? Why do you hold the things that you hold, and why are you doing the things that you do?
You have a question there?
Yeah. About 10 years ago, we had Dallas Willard here for a lecture in a conference on early phenomenology. And he gave another lecture while here on a project he was just starting on, as I recall, the recovery of moral knowledge. And I'd just like to hear from you what came of that, what he meant, how far he succeeded in that project of recovering moral knowledge, and where you see points of contact with the Hildebrand tradition.
Yeah, so he was working on this book for the last, I want to say, 10 to maybe 13 years of his life, something like that, that was titled The Disappearance of Moral Knowledge. And that sort of sets the stage, I suppose, for the recovery of moral knowledge. I didn't know that he was presenting himself as working on what sounds like maybe a separate project on the recovery of moral knowledge. In the book, as it finally turned out, the final chapter does sketch sort of the outlines of what Dallas took to be a promising approach to the recovery of moral knowledge. But beyond that, I don't know of any larger scale work that he was engaged in with that theme. Now, interestingly enough, this is one of the reasons that I personally wanted to reach out to the von Hildebrand group and start this joint reading group that we had last fall, because it seemed to me in my early encounters with von Hildebrandian thought that von Hildebrand was a person who could put flesh on the bones, the sort of bare bones outline that Dallas had sketched in this final chapter of the book, The Disappearance of Moral Knowledge. So and that sense was validated in the context of our 8 weeks working through readings from both authors. So it seems to me that there's the possibility here for a very fruitful collaboration where von Hildebrand sort of gives us the details of how to work out an epistemology of moral knowledge that fits with the broad vision that Dallas had.
Thank you. Yeah, I know these were more Walter's comments, but I wonder if you guys could comment and tease out a little bit more this theme of authenticity. And I think it was very interesting, this connection with kind of verifying through knowledge, but maybe also its connection with the affectivity, and what does it mean to kind of have an authentic life. I am thinking also, playing with this idea of Sinatra as he did. A lot of people discuss an authentic experience of God. I don't know if we're operating in the same terms there or not. But yeah, just maybe your guys' thoughts too on that comment that Walter made, and kind of elaborating this phrase that I hear all the time in my work, is this experience authentic or not? And kind of very self-referential a lot of times. But then what does it mean to objectively verify that?
We, several years ago at one of these Hildebrand seminars, we had a whole session devoted to the theme of authenticity. I don't remember quite how long ago that was.
2019.
19, yeah. And that was a very good session. There's a whole serious reflection on this theme of authenticity. I think clearly there's a kind of false idolatry of authenticity, which takes this form of I'll have it my way, really putting the ego first and demanding that our experience of God conform to us rather than us conforming to God. But there's another kind of authenticity that I think is proper. Hildebrand speaks of the weak personality that is easily overcome by another strong personality. And sometimes you see this kind of codependent friendship where one person is simply living through the life of another, and that other is dictating to the weaker party the whole terms of life and the relationship. That person doesn't have their own sense of value, but they live through the sense of another's value in a servile way. And that is clearly a threat to authenticity and the threat to an authentic relationship with God. I think sometimes this happens in bad spiritual communities. You have a kind of cult of personality. One person has a particularly powerful spiritual conviction, and you have a number of followers that simply experience God through that stronger force of personality, but don't have their own response to God in their own interior life. And so a true authenticity would include that interior, and I think this notion from Hildebrand of endorsement, being able to undersign, and even if I am obeying a spiritual director or obeying a commandment of God, obeying a dictate of the church, or submitting my intellect to the teaching of the church, yet nevertheless, I commit myself from my person to that, and it thereby becomes authentic, even if it is humble and obedient.
I'll just add that when Walter is talking about authenticity, I mean, there's an interesting relationship between, I think, what he's talking about and what we would normally mean by authenticity, where it's like a characteristic of the person, right? He's talking about authenticity with respect to acts of consciousness. And he's got in mind, I guess, a case of something like this. So back when I was younger and in Boy Scouts, I remember my first camping outing with my Boy Scout troop, and the older scouts apparently had this sort of hazing ritual that they would put the newbies through. They would take us on what they called a snipe hunt, right? Anyone familiar with the the practice of snipe hunting, right? So, you know, and basically what would happen is they would take us out into the deep woods with paper bags and flashlights, and they'd say, "Okay, now we're gonna hunt snipes. They're only out at night, and we're gonna go off into the woods over here, and we're gonna scare these things out of the underbrush. They're gonna come running for you. You got to hold your flashlight down behind the paper bag and catch these little beasties as they come running out of the underbrush, and close it up real tight. And then they'd walk off into the woods and they'd leave us. Right? Well, the interesting thing is, no one knew what a snipe was supposed to be. Right? I mean, it's like, how would we know when we actually had succeeded? What if like a chipmunk came running out of the woods and I caught one in my bag? Would I think, is this a snipe or is this not a snipe? I'm using the concept of a snipe in an inauthentic way. None of us knew what would count as an actual, successful snipe hunt or a failure of a snipe hunt, right? But we use other less silly concepts in this way often as well. I mean, I think in theological context, how many people have any idea what they mean when they say the word Trinity? Right? And you can kind of go through the motions and say, oh, yes, I believe in the Trinity. And say, well, not that we can ever have a fully adequate understanding of what that means, but we can have some beginnings of an idea of what that means, and, would have some idea of what it would mean to have a direct experience of the Trinity, I suppose, right? We might be somewhat mistaken about what that might look like, but we can have some content to the concept. If you don't have any content to the concept that you can identify, if you're just using the word sort of blankly, that's what Walter means by inauthentic conceptualization. Does that make sense? Okay.
Well, thanks to both of you very much. Before we do a round of applause, before people start getting up, Christopher will do an update on the Hildebrand Press in a few minutes. We want to give you all a chance to use the restroom, get some coffee, whatever you need. But do come back. There may be some free books, so definitely come back. Anything else? That's it. And then thank you very much for a wonderful panel.